that out of the way. And again, just really want to welcome everyone to today's session and tell you a little bit more about the Accelerating Climate Resiliency program and speaker series that we have here at MAPC. So as I mentioned, this speaker series is part of our Accelerating Climate Resilience program, where we're working in partnership with the Barr Foundation to accelerate climate resilience in the region by helping municipalities advance strategies that protect people, places, and communities from the impacts of climate change. And our intent is really to fund through our funding program actionable resilience interventions that facilitate long-term innovative changes, leading to greater readiness for climate change. And we've really sought to, in the 3 rounds we've had so far, and as we look to continue this program into the future, to elevate projects that will advance climate equity, regional coordination, and social cohesion. In addition to our funding program, we've also been honored to be able to support over the last several months a resiliency community of practice for our grant program awardees. And there, the awardees have a chance to share skills and knowledge, discuss successes and challenges, and build a support network of climate resiliency champions, really learning from one another as they go. And then a third conjunction part of this Accelerating Climate Resilience program that we have is our speaker series. This is open to the public, and we're so glad that you've joined us here today. So every other month, we seek to bring in experts and practitioners from across the country who can speak to the ways that they are perceiving and advancing resilience. And so we are so honored to have the panelists that we do today. So before I pass it on to those panelists, I did just want to do one last thank you to the Barr Foundation for their generous support of this program and the speaker series, to our MAPC staff who are working so hard to make this event happen, particularly Van Du, Ella Wise, Sasha Parodi, and Elise Harmon, and to our Executive Director, Mark Dreesen, one of our biggest supporters, and for whom I know today's subject matter is near and dear to him. So I'd like to pass it now to our Executive Director, Mark Dreesen. Mark?
Cami, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who helped put this panel together. Thanks, of course, to the Barr Foundation. We're very glad to have so many distinguished speakers. It's always good to see Representative Vargas. Glad you're with us, Andy. And I did want to shout out to 2 people who I saw on the list. My former colleague from the Mass Association of CDCs, Latifa Ziad, who's now at NOAA. It's so good to see you, Latifa. And also Mary Antes from the town of Wayland, who I think is like the first person I met when I started at MAPC. Mary, it's great to have you with us today. You know, some of my staff know that I often start things with a quote, and there's a Faulkner quote that I really love, which I think is particularly apt in Boston. And it goes like this. It says, the past is never dead. It isn't even past. And I think that tells us a lot about the subject we're going to be talking about today. It's hard to understand some of the things that we see as part of everyday life today, some of the injustices we see, some of the ways in which climate change is sometimes slowly and sometimes not so slowly causing difficulties in our lives, and not recognize that it is part of patterns and activities that were intentional, that come from the past, sometimes the deep past. And without an understanding of those things, we can't really understand where we are today. My staff also knows that one of the reasons I do what I do is because my family was displaced from their house because of redlining and block busting in the 1970s in the city of Boston. And it's influenced me a great deal in the course of my life. And it always makes me think, the older I get, the more I think that people need to understand the deep roots of some of the injustices that we're seeing in our society today. You know, they say about weeds, you can pull them out and they keep regrowing unless you pull them out by the roots. And I am so pleased that we're going to do a little educating today, that we're going to do a little examining of history, not because we have to live in history, but because in order to make a better future, we need to have an understanding of that history. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Ella Wise in our land use department, who is going to begin the panel today for us. Ella.
Thanks very much, Mark. Welcome everyone again. Thank you for joining. My name is Ella from MAPC. I'm honored to introduce the topic and the panel today. So public policy and planning have created inequitable climate impacts. Today, we're focusing on housing policy and how it's created patterns of investment and disinvestment that in turn have contributed to extreme heat in some neighborhoods and not others. As the public sector contributed to these problems, we can also work in community to mitigate them, both in neighborhoods that have experienced disinvestment as well as investment. I wanted to note that this article this panel is inspired by articles that were published in the New York Times and WBUR, and we're posting the links to those in the chat. So thank you to the journalists who brought attention to this topic originally. This is just the beginning of this conversation. We recognize the importance of continuing the discussion with more perspectives, especially with communities of color and those most impacted. So now to the agenda. Next slide. And then the next slide, please. Great. First, we'll start off with Dr. Jeremy Hoffman, who will explain redlining and how it relates to extreme heat. And then Representative Andy Vargas will discuss his experience and leadership related to redlining and climate justice in Haverhill, a gateway city in Massachusetts. Then we'll continue to hear more about strategies to address the challenge. So we'll zoom into the community level and hear from Mr. Tennis Lilly about his work with community to prioritize greening strategies in neighborhoods that have been underinvested in. And then finally, we'll hear from Vice Mayor Lori Drosty about her work to reform exclusionary zoning and expand opportunity in neighborhoods that have benefited from investment. We aim to have time for question and answer at the end. So please add your questions into the chat throughout the program, and we'll save them all and try to get to as many as possible at the end. So now I have the honor of turning it over to our first panelist, and you'll see the full bios of the panelists in the chat. So please check that out. I'll just be giving us a summary of the bio. Dr. Hoffman is the David and Jane Cohn Scientist at the Science Museum of Virginia and affiliate faculty in the L. Douglas Wilder School and Center for Environmental Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University. Dr. Hoffman connects audiences to their changing planet through participatory research and hands-on experiences. Dr. Hoffman, welcome. Thank you for being here. So the question we pose to you, what is redlining and what is the relationship with extreme heat?
Well, thank you so much, Ella, and thanks so much to my colleagues on the panel, and thanks to all of the participants for joining. In order to answer that question, interestingly, I can't start the story in Boston as much as in that region as much as I'd like to. We'll come back to that in a second. But I just want to first say that a lot of this work has been supported by groups, federal and state funding, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration being one of the main sources of funding, both for our education focus at the Science Museum of Virginia and the research that I'll share with you that has spun off all of this focus on extreme heat over the last few years. And so in order to get started, we actually have to go back in time. 1995 in the city of Chicago, Illinois, extreme heat wave took temperatures over 110 degrees for over 40 hours in a weekend. The temperature didn't dip below 80 degrees at night for several days. And depending on the estimate that you hear, it's probably around 750 individuals lost their lives due to direct causes of heat in this heat wave. The sociologist Eric Kleinenberg wrote a really fantastic book called Heat Wave, and it's a social autopsy of this disaster in 1995. And really through his work was the first kind of deep dive into recognizing that there were particular neighborhoods, those that had been systematically underinvested in for generations on the southwestern side of Chicago, that bore out higher rates of death. And these are specifically in elderly communities of color who were unable to and did not want to open their windows for fear of crime. And so why do I also bring up Chicago? Well, I was growing up only a few miles away from where that photo was taken that summer. And beyond my impeccable fashion sense, I have to acknowledge the fact that, my family had a yard party that weekend. We had a slip and slide. I was having really nice air conditioning. And, I reflect nowadays in the work that I do at the Science Museum that there are immense, systems of privilege that kept my family extremely comfortable during this disaster at the expense of many lives just a few miles away. So how does climate change fit into this? In order to get to this, we have to talk a little bit about climate change. And so by any account, any way that you would talk about a heat wave is getting worse over the last several decades. Frequency of their occurrence, their duration, where they occur in the heat season, and their subjective intensity has actually gotten more intense as well. So heat waves are becoming more intense. We already know from studies of places like Chicago and Philadelphia that extreme weather fatalities in this country are most attributable to extreme heat. But you don't hear about them like you do about the kind of charismatic storms like hurricanes and tornadoes, but they kill more people on average than both of those storms combined. Now, we also know from the last 30 to 50 years of research that heat doesn't express itself the same way across the built environment. If I were to all jump us into this like Miss Frizzle on the Magic School Bus and was going to tell you that we're going to go to the warmest place to the touch, think to yourself where you would go. Same time, think about on the opposite side of that. Where are you going to go to the coolest spot to the touch? And by using a really simple scientific technology as a thermal camera that sees kind of the skin temperature of the landscape around us, we can see brighter colors here being the warmest places. The asphalt parking lot, by far the warmest. Under the big mature oak tree, the darkest colors are also the coolest places. But there's some really amazing stories in between, from the colors of the cars and the materials that the seating and the sidewalks are made out of, contributing to their skin temperature. Then also the choice of vegetation, from a non-native European grass versus native plants made for rain garden purposes, and their deep tap roots, keeping them relatively cooler through evapotranspiration of deeper groundwater. Now, there are a few different ways to assess extreme heat. That surface temperature one being one major way. Another is through participatory research that you might have heard called citizen or community science. And this is back in 2017, we collaborated with a network of collaboration partnerships around the city of Richmond to assess the city's temperature. With the help of Vivek Chandas's group at Portland State University, they brought us these kind of really sophisticated looking PVC pipes, but inside of them, they had really sensitive thermometers that allowed us to take very detailed observations of air temperature throughout our city during a heat wave. And interestingly, we found a 16-degree Fahrenheit difference between the coolest and warmest place at the exact same time on the same day. And largely, much like that picture you saw from that parking lot, it had to do with the relative dominance of human-built structures to kind of more natural landscapes and tree canopy. That was the driving factor for those differences. Follow-up research that we've done with our local Office of Office of Emergency Medical Services shows that where the ambulance goes for extreme heat is directly related to where those hot pockets are in our city. In fact, this is a relationship that's stronger than chance and disproportionately affects residents of color in the city of Richmond. So it's clearly an environmental justice issue. And through ongoing collaborations, when we got our results, and since, we started to recognize, and several of our community partners pointed out, wow, that map looks a lot like the redlining map. And at the time, I had not yet learned a lot about redlining, but I'll tell you a short little bit about what went on. And in the 1930s and 40s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was basically granted the ability by the federal government to go into around 250 cities nationwide and rate individual neighborhoods along a perceived spectrum for safety for investment, in the sense of like, real estate investment, access to loans and those sorts of things. But really, it was subjectively based on who was living in those neighborhoods. We can see now in the descriptions of the individuals that were living in these communities that it was largely based along racial lines, where 100% of the redlined neighborhoods in Richmond were predominantly Black communities. And then also across the country, examples of xenophobia and rating neighborhoods lower based on their immigrant status. My dad grew up in a part of Chicago that was given a red line simply because they were all Polish immigrants. So this practice was largely based in the sense of who was living there, and not really some sort of objective way to rate their safety for investment. Meanwhile, the green-lined areas, especially in Richmond and across the country, remain to this day what they were at that time, which is wealthy enclaves of white residents. And the economics literature has consistently connected these things to long-term socioeconomic outcomes, namely negative ones, where this paper published in January showed that there were long-term effects, causal relationships between the location and residents of these redline neighborhoods and having several decades of cohort level outcomes socioeconomically and socially, including family structure and incarceration. So these redlining maps were extremely nefarious and had long-term socioeconomic outcomes. But what we wanted to ask was, what about the environment? And we were able to show in a paper published in January 2020 that formerly redlined areas across the country are relatively warmer than their non-redline neighbors. They're dominated by impervious surfaces and have many fewer trees. And some people have pointed out, well, the HOLC inherited the conditions of these communities. And that's absolutely true. A and B neighborhoods at this time were also in the 30s and 40s. These are descriptors that were used to describe these neighborhoods. They were already seen as wooded and shaded. And the C and D neighborhoods, the red-lined and yellow-lined neighborhoods, already had the indicators of environmental justice, like manufacturing odors and paved and hot. So not to say that redlining caused these environmental differences, but they made them lawful. They made them in place for generations, and their effects extend even after they were banned in the Fair Housing Act of 1968. If you want to learn something really amazing, watch Stephen DeBerry's TED Talk, Why the Wrong Side of the Tracks is Usually the East Side of Cities. It turns out to be a much deeper story that goes back to the very spin of the earth, which is fascinating from a scientific perspective. But back to our paper, we took a look at all 250 cities, aggregated them into 108 urban areas, and using surface temperatures estimated from the Landsat satellite, we were able to show that during the summer, these areas are on average about 5 degrees warmer than the green-lined areas of the same cities. And in 94% of the cities that were redlined, this same pattern exists. This is dominated by their underlying land use. As we saw in that picture of the parking lot, these areas are dominated by those dark, hard surfaces and have many fewer trees than their non-redlined counterparts. These results and others have been confirmed in follow-up studies published over the last 2 years, which gives us confidence in our conclusions about the tie between these policies and present-day environmental conditions. But it's not just heat. There's other things going on here as well. Several papers from Nardoni et al. Showed that there's correlations between these areas and asthma rates, which can be attributed to urban renewal programs that placed interstates in these areas. There's been linkages now with urban flooding conditions. To bring it home to you in Boston, the Museum of Science did a Wicked Hot Boston campaign, which followed our similar campaign that we did in Richmond in 2017, finding the same things. But we're not stuck in these same, it's not only in these urban areas. In fact, a paper that was just out a few weeks ago in July showed that 71% of counties in the entire United States show a significant racial disparity in heat exposure. Bringing it into Middlesex County nearby, we see, using the Urban Heat USA platform, the least white communities in the county have the hottest summer days and nights. So this isn't restricted to urban areas by any means. I want to just share really fast, the Science Museum of Virginia is taking this surface parking lot that I showed you at the beginning of the talk and turning it into a civic green space, indicating one of the ways that we can actually work to solve this problem long-term and in the present. So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope we learned a little bit about how redlining has contributed in some way to the present-day vulnerability and exposure of residents to extreme heat and other climate stressors. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hoffman. Now I have the honor of turning it over to Representative Vargas. State Representative Andy Vargas represents the 3rd Essex District, Haverhill, in the Massachusetts House of Representatives. He's a member of the Massachusetts Black and Latino Legislative Caucus and was previously elected to the Haverhill City Council, where he served as the city's first Latino elected official. Representative Vargas, thank you so much for being here. So our question to you is, what is the legacy of redlining in Haverhill, and how does it relate to climate impacts?
Thank you, Ella. Really appreciate that. And thank you, Dr. Hoffman, for doing a fantastic job. I don't know why they put a politician after a doctor. This is going to be horrible now. No, in all seriousness, thank you all for putting together this wonderful event to highlight how the past, as Mark said, is still present and still having impact on our lives today. I come from a family that came from the Dominican Republic and found each other. My parents found each other in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They were renting there for a couple of years. I was born in Cambridge, and I lived there until I was about 6 years old, until housing costs got just too expensive. And my parents moved to a place that was 45 minutes north of Boston called Haverhill, and they found a home for under $200,000, a 2-family home in a redlined area. But nonetheless, they were homeowners, and that was the home where I was raised, and certainly have some stories related to how we had some flooding in our basement a couple of times, while some of my colleagues and friends in other parts of Haverhill did not. So let's go to the next slide here. So I won't reiterate what Dr. Hoffman already said, but look, redlining is the systemic denial of services and investments to residents of racially associated neighborhoods, right? This isn't just about housing. It's not just about climate. It's about services and programs that are made available to certain people versus others in other parts of the city. Redlining did not create racial segregation. It's important to note that, but it codified it, denying home ownership to many Black and immigrant families. And we saw that here in Haverhill as well. And the areas with larger populations of racial minorities were labeled hazardous, literally, or high risk, and discouraged investments in these neighborhoods for decades. Next slide. So this is a real red line map of Haverhill. And for one of those maps, the one where, or one of those zones, the area where I grew up in, the description under detrimental influences says, quote, concentration of Negroes along Ashland Street, large garage on Ashland Street. So these are the descriptions that you would get in these redlined areas that would discourage investment, and not only investment from the private sector, but from the public sector as well. When you think about sewage, water, infrastructure investments that are necessary to mitigate the effects of climate change. Next slide. And as I said earlier, the most heavily redlined neighborhoods in Haverhill in the 1930s almost identically match up with the lowest income census tracts in the city today. So in my office, we overlaid the redline districts with the lowest income census tracts, and they're just about the same still to this day. And so when we talk about the pervasive effects of systemic racism, you don't need to look any further than that. We also see that overlaying those redline maps with the heat data, similar to what Dr. Hoffman just presented, again, also validates that the vulnerability to extreme heat and flooding is also higher in these redlined areas. And I remember as a kid, there was a Mother's Day flood where our basement was entirely filled with water. And I remember going to high school the next day and asking my friends, did you guys get flooded also? What happened to your basements? And depending on where they lived, some said, yeah, we got some flooding. And those that lived on the outskirts of the city said, no, we just had a lot of rain, but we didn't experience any flooding. And so it goes to show the increasing effects of climate change and the costs of that, right? Because my family had to bear that cost to mitigate the flooding that we had in our basement. The historically redlined neighborhoods in Haverhill also continue to be more Black and Latino than any other parts of the city as well. And so these are forces that are at play from 100 years ago that are still affecting the socioeconomic status of families today. Next slide. So similar to what Dr. Hoffman presented, this is Haverhill's heat vulnerability index map right next to the red line map. You'll see that they match up pretty nicely as well. And finally, this is just a quote from The Color of Law. If you haven't read it, highly recommend it. Today's residential segregation in the North, South, Midwest is not the unintended consequence of individual choices and of otherwise well-meaning law or regulation, but of unhidden public policy that explicitly segregated every metropolitan area in the United States. And so we were explicit in creating redlining. We need to be explicit in our solutions to get out of it. And if we could just go back to the slide that shows Haverhill's redline map. A couple more back. Yeah, right there. So the other thing that's important to talk about here is power, right? Because there are power dynamics at play here. When we think about the all at large city council and school committee system that we have here in Haverhill, the majority, if not all, of the elected officials in the city live in areas that aren't redlined or that weren't redlined. And so when we think about creating systems and policies and procedures that can help us undo the effects of systemic racism and redlining, one of the things that we're working on here in Haverhill is shifting our city government from an all that large system to district specific city councilors and school committee members, so that you can actually have representation from folks that live in these formerly redlined areas, so that they can advocate for the type of climate mitigation effects that are necessary for those particular areas of our city, in addition to housing investment, infrastructure, et cetera. The other piece that I think it's important for us to understand is, the same way we were intentional about redlining, we have to be intentional about our housing and climate mitigation resources, right? As we think about the American Rescue Plan dollars that are before us now, as we think about, knock on wood, hopefully the infrastructure funding that will be coming from the federal government down to states, we want to make sure we're intentional about investing that funding in zones that were redlined and ensuring that we're retrofitting these homes and that we're creating climate mitigation solutions that can ensure that the families that found a home here, like mine, are able to actually afford to live there and are safe to live there, and can start to build some intergenerational wealth that can undo the years of systemic racism and inequality. So I'll stop there and just want to thank you all for inviting me to participate in this, and happy to be an ally and a partner as we look to undo the effects of redlining.
Thank you so much, Mr. Representative Vargas. I appreciate you bringing in discussion of power dynamics and the opportunities provided by new federal relief funding. Okay, next we have Mr. Lilly. Mr. Lilly is the Climate Resiliency Program Manager for Groundwork Lawrence, where he manages the Green Streets Urban Forestry Program. He's a 35-year resident of Lawrence, where he's served on the Lawrence Conservation Commission since 2001. Welcome, Mr. Lilly. We're so glad to have you. So our question to you is, how have you worked with community at the local level to prioritize greening in previously redlined neighborhoods? And sorry, you're on mute. There you go.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm going to speak for just a couple minutes about the work that we do about the city of Lawrence and the history of environmental justice and the state of the urban forest there. And then I'm going to concentrate the majority of my remarks on outreach and engagement. Next slide. So very quickly, Groundwork Lawrence, where I've worked since 2017, is a community-based nonprofit. It was established 22 years ago. It is part of the Groundwork USA network, a network of 20 groundwork trusts throughout the United States. There are 4 in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It is based on the groundwork model that exists in the United Kingdom. And our primary role is to bring residents, the business community, government officials, and other stakeholders together to identify issues of environmental justice and to collaborate on community-driven decision-making and community-driven solutions. The key to that work is that residents are in the driver's seat. We have 4 primary program areas: community organizing, open space and environmental improvement, which is where my program sits, education and job training, and healthy food and healthy living. Next slide. So about the city of Lawrence. Lawrence was America's first planned city. It was created by wealthy Boston industrialists, carved out of land in Methuen, Andover, North Andover. It was created to serve the burgeoning textile industry. It was sited to take advantage of water power from the Merrimack River. It welcomed immigrants from all over the world. At one point at the early 20th century, Over 90 nations were represented among the residents, and over 40 languages were spoken. Today, the majority of residents are Latino, and they're from either Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico primarily. English language is spoken in over 70% of all households, and the median family income is just a little over 39,000, which is about 40% of the state average. So Lawrence is a sort of textbook environmental justice community. We check off all of those boxes pretty much. Next slide. So this, by the way, some of the images in the next two slides are from Groundwork's Climate Safe Neighborhood project, which I'll have a link at the end of this presentation. We've done some mapping for both Lawrence and Haverhill that I think restate a lot of the points that Representative Vargas made in his presentation. So you can see here in the slide on the left, the image on the left, Lawrence is sitting right over the Merrimack River, carved out of surrounding communities. And on the image on the right-hand side, you can see impervious surface. Now, not surprisingly, most of Lawrence, and this is common in most cities, is covered with impervious surface. Next slide. And the slide on the left is tree canopy. Not surprisingly, again, the heart of Lawrence is pretty much devoid of tree canopy. The trees are concentrated in a few parks, and the more affluent neighborhoods, which are sort of on the outskirts and the higher ground around the city. This is where the mill owners, the managers, the professional class made their homes in more suburban neighborhoods. And you see here the image on the right. Not surprisingly, the warmer surfaces are the ones without trees, without significant tree canopy, and where man-made surfaces, concrete, asphalt, etc., dominate the landform. And that's just a perfect example of the urban heat island effect. Next slide. So Lawrence was not redlined, unlike many surrounding communities. But because of the nature of the city itself, because it was created as a destination for immigrants, for workers, the very structure of the city itself was a form of redlining. You can see here the image on the left. This is an advertisement from that appeared in a newspaper in the late 1800s. And you can see how it illustrates where different ethnic groups, different nationalities settled throughout the city. And this was something that was actually actively encouraged. If you were an Italian immigrant, you were expected to live in the Italian neighborhood. If you were a French Canadian, you lived in the Franco-Belgian neighborhood. If you were from Lebanon or Syria, you lived in that neighborhood. So this is something that was, and it's not uncommon in a lot of immigrant communities, but this is something that was really actively encouraged. And there's a huge difference in the quality of housing stock in these neighborhoods, where you have small 4,000 square foot housing lots dominated by triple deckers, and the larger suburban neighborhoods where the professional classes lived. One thing that you would find throughout many cities in the United States, the image on the right, is this is an actual racial covenant for a neighborhood in South Lawrence that was built in the post-war era, very suburban, very comfortable. And it essentially states that non-whites aren't even allowed to occupy property in this neighborhood unless they're a domestic servant. I knew these things existed until I actually saw this for myself. It didn't resonate. It was shocking to see this. And these were commonly found well into the 1950s in this country. Even after they were unenforceable, they still showed up on property deeds. Next slide. So I want to touch very briefly on the program that I manage called Green Streets. Groundwork Lawrence has been planting trees since 2007. Well, we've been planting trees pretty much for the entire time that we've existed, but in 2007, we made urban forestry a full-time program area. And in 2016, after planting nearly 1,000 trees, we partnered with the Massachusetts Green the Gateway Cities program. Green the Gateway Cities is a terrific program that we have here in the Commonwealth. There are 16 gateway communities that receive funding from the state. The goal is to plant 2,800 trees in a 500-acre planting zone. And the idea behind this is to close in the tree canopy and combat the urban heat island effect. And hopefully by doing so, bring a host of benefits, but primarily reduce energy consumption and help people save money and also combat global warming. Next slide. So how do we do this? Planting trees is actually pretty easy. Planting a lot of trees is easy. You just need more people doing it. Finding homes for these trees is not so simple. One of the goals of Green the Gateway Cities is to have the majority of these trees planted in private yards. That's both to maximize the impact and also increase the likelihood that these trees live to maturity. This requires a lot of engagement. And I contrast engagement with outreach. Outreach is just putting information in front of people. It could be putting a flyer on someone's door or sending them a postcard. That's good, and that's a nice start. But engagement is how these programs succeed. Engagement requires actually spending time with people, communicating with people. It is really about creating a relationship with the people and the neighborhood that you're trying to work in. Some of the critical points, the key points to this are meeting people where they live, meeting people where they work. This is one of our mantras here at Groundwork. We meet people where they live. You also have to approach this being very open-minded. There's a tendency among some environmental groups to simply come into a place, look around, say, aha, we know what your problem is, and we've got the solution. Let us help you. That is almost always an approach that's going to fail. You have to create a relationship with the neighborhood that you're working in and let the stakeholders, let the residents educate you on what's going on what the problems are from their perspective. And once you've created that relationship, and it has to be a relationship that's built on trust and transparency, once you create that relationship, you can share and collaborate with residents, with stakeholders to help identify these problems, which in our case is the lack of meaningful tree cover, and to find a solution. And this is really the key to getting most of your trees in private yards. Next slide. One of the most important things is letting people tell their story. Every tree that we plant has some kind of a story behind it. It might just be someone who wants to make the yard more attractive. It might be someone who wants shade because it reminds them of a place where they grew up. These two images are residents of the same neighborhood. We planted their trees on the same day, but they're very different stories. The gentleman on the left is retired and wanted to beautify his yard and was looking forward to taking care of his trees. The woman on the right was a cancer survivor and saw this tree as an opportunity to celebrate life. And these images were taken nearly 3 years ago. Both of these residents are still here. The trees are doing great. And in fact, the woman on the right, I just ran into her about 2 weeks ago, and she's looking for more trees for her property. But she's been a champion of trees in her neighborhood and has encouraged her neighbors to get trees also. Next slide. It's important to collaborate with other stakeholders. Groundwork would not be successful with at this program if we didn't work with the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, with a lot of other funders and stakeholders in the community. This image on the left here, these are volunteers from Bank of America, one of our most enthusiastic supporters. They came out to plant trees with us on the Spicker River Greenway. And you see here on the right, this is my colleague, Eric Lundquist, who's the bearded fellow with the safety vest on. We're working with students from one of our Head Start offices. We planted, this is in fall, obviously, there are no leaves on that tree, but we planted a number of trees in their playground, and the students all adopted them, and it gave us a chance to engage with them and to teach them about the importance of trees. And this was a lot of fun. Getting kids together is always a magical thing when they help get the trees in the ground, and that enthusiasm is contagious. Next slide. Here's one of the projects that we're really proud of. This is Greenfield Street in Lawrence. Greenfield Street is a working class sort of entry level first single family home neighborhood. That when it was constructed had tree lined streets, enormous lindens. But because the city did not invest in taking care of these trees or taking care of the sidewalks for many decades, these trees grew too large, had created a lot of problems, created some negative attitudes about trees that we had to overcome to work on that street. And the city's solution when they had the money to replace the damaged sidewalks were to simply remove all of these massive shade trees. Because we spent a lot of time working with the people on the street, engaging with this neighborhood, we were able to bring residents together. There's a lot of pushback from residents on that street to that plan. We were able to bring residents together, bring our colleagues in City Hall together, and get everyone on the same page as to how to preserve most of those trees, which we ended up preserving most of them, but also how to restore trees that had been lost over years, trees that had to be removed over the past couple of decades. The people who lived on the street wanted more tree canopy. So we came up with an innovative design that would put tree pits behind the sidewalk and allow residents to adopt them. And we actually ended up letting residents select the trees that they were going to plant in their front yard. This is an example of where engagement brings you. Engagement allows you to collaborate to solve these problems. Next slide. And finally, looking at this image on the left, our heat image, and looking at the image on the right, which are trees planted between 2016 and 2020. You can see that not only were we able to carve out a planting zone that tried to put trees where they were needed the most and would have the greatest benefit, but because we were able to engage meaningfully in these neighborhoods, we put a lot of trees where they're really going to have the most impact. Our next phase of tree planting is to fill in on the south side of the city, fill in the rest of those heat islands, to move into those areas to try and do the same thing that we've been doing since 2016. So this is an example of using science and data to guide your efforts, and also combining that with meaningful engagement with people in the neighborhood. Next slide. Finally, here are some links. I believe the slide deck is going to be available for everyone at the end of the presentation. But some terrific resources: the Tree Equity Score with AmericanForest.org, Climate Safe Neighborhoods, which is a project that has the Redline maps for Haverhill as well. It's a terrific project that I encourage everyone to visit. Mass Urban Canopy, that's Green the Gateway Cities, important supporter of our tree planting. They're in 16 cities in the Commonwealth. And of course, the link for Green Streets, which is our urban forestry program at Groundwork Lawrence. And that is it.
Thanks very much, Mr. Lilly. I really appreciated your emphasis on meeting communities where they are, and loved the personal stories of individual trees. Finally, we're going to kind of switch gears and turn it to Vice Mayor Drosty. So Vice Mayor Lori Drosty has served on the Berkeley City Council, Berkeley, California, for 7 years. She won as a pro-housing candidate in one of Berkeley's most historically exclusionary council districts, and authored legislation to end exclusionary zoning in Berkeley once and for all. Vice Mayor Drosty, we're so grateful to have you here today. So our question to you is, what is exclusionary zoning? And how have you worked to reform it to expand opportunities in cooler neighborhoods that have benefited from investment?
Thank you so much for having me here today. And hopefully somebody can bring up the slide deck. Wonderful, thank you. So before I begin answering this question, I wanted to provide you with a bit of history of Berkeley, California. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I represent the Elmwood neighborhood, where single-family zoning was born in 1916. This type of exclusionary zoning forbade the construction of anything other than one home per lot. And at the time, Berkeley's city attorney wrote that he was protecting the home against the intrusions of the less desirable and floating renter class. And the use of these zoning laws and racially restrictive property deeds and covenants prevented BIPOC communities from purchasing or leasing property in East Berkeley. And in fact, many of these measures were put in place to protect Berkeley from Chinese laundromats or African-American dance halls from being located in certain parts of the city. After a Supreme Court case in 1917, explicitly racially restrictive zoning was outlawed, but maintaining neighborhood character or districts became paramount, and real estate contracts still stipulated that property owners must be white. So why don't we go to the next slide? As you well know, and Dr. Hoffman referenced, in 1933, the federal government created the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which produced these residential maps of neighborhoods to identify mortgage lending risks. And as you can see, these maps, this is a Berkeley map, identified the best areas, the green, the best areas, still desirable, blue, definitely declining were the yellow, and the hazardous were red neighborhoods. And this enabled discriminatory lending practices, later called redlining, and allowed lenders to enforce local segregation standards. So next slide, please. In 1973, the residents of Berkeley passed a neighborhood preservation ordinance, which severely restricted multi-unit housing in certain parts of Berkeley. And if we can go to the next slide, you'll see that a variety of missing middle housing types, duplexes, triplexes, small unit building typologies, bungalow courts, were very common throughout the entirety of Berkeley, including my neighborhood, which is now single family zoned. But until it was outlawed, we have fourplexes and small apartment buildings throughout the entirety of Berkeley. But after the passage of the neighborhood preservation ordinance, you saw this decline significantly. So why don't we go to the next map? Until 1984, Martin Luther King Jr. Way was known as Grove Street. And for decades, Grove Street created a wall of segregation down the center of Berkeley, where Asian Americans and African Americans essentially couldn't live east of Grove Street due to those racially restrictive covenants that barred them from purchasing or leasing properties. And many cities still retain the vestiges of those exclusionary zoning practices. And we can see how our current zoning maps align with these older maps on the next slide. So with that background in mind, I began to think about this question of what role do neighborhoods like mine have in addressing these important issues of our time: climate justice, social and racial and economic equity. So why don't we go to the next slide and start with climate justice. So as you can see, areas of single family zoning correspond with higher rates of greenhouse gas emissions. So if you look at the higher household carbon footprints, you'll see they're in areas that are single family zoned, while formerly redlined and now multifamily areas align with lower household carbon footprints. Nobel Prize winning climate researchers at Cal, Dan Kamen leading this project, quantified local and state opportunities in how cities like mine can reduce greenhouse gases, and they identified urban infill as the most effective local strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And if we were to even zoom out further from this map, you'd see farther afield where people have to commute into Berkeley because they can't afford to live in Berkeley now. The median priced home is $1.5 million. So they have even larger carbon footprints outside of Berkeley. So eliminating exclusionary zoning not only has the potential to shrink the average carbon footprint of some Berkeley neighborhoods, but also will give people access to housing that is closer to jobs and transit, further lowering carbon footprints. If we can go to the next slide. Estimates of tree cover also show another way in which exclusionary zoning interfaces with climate justice. Tree cover is associated with decreased heat island effects and cooling costs, as our previous speakers mentioned. But the areas of Berkeley with the greatest tree cover tend to be associated with historical exclusion. And conversely, this also shows why areas of formerly redlined and current multifamily development zoned areas deserve additional resources for planting and maintaining street trees and tree cover in other public spaces. If we can go to the next slide, you'll also see that this slide shows why ending exclusionary zoning is a climate justice issue, especially in California and the Bay Area, because of the cooling effects of the Pacific Ocean and our famous fog here. Summer temperatures in the Bay Area and Berkeley tend to be pretty comfortable at the coast, even when it's broiling inland. But unfortunately, our exclusionary housing policies have tended to push, again, more people inland, further away from the Bay Area near these jobs. And this exposes them to uncomfortable and even dangerous summer temperatures, which are really only getting worse, and compels them to worsen climate change by commuting long distances and demanding more energy for indoor climate control. If we go to the next slide, we'll see about our air quality levels. I'm sure you've all seen in the news the wildfires that are raging throughout California, and it's been worsened in recent years. Exclusionary zoning has a role in these hazardous smoke events. The entire Bay Area has experienced poor air quality at times from wildfires. In fact, last year, there was a day in which the sun never appeared to even rise in the Bay Area. It was dark, almost orange all day. But areas nearest to the ocean, as you can see here, tend to have better air quality and see air quality improve sooner than areas further inland and closer to the bigger fires. What's more, forcing people inland not only puts more people at risk for smoke, but actually more at risk for the fires themselves in the Sierra foothills. And if we go to the next map, we can talk a bit about displacement as well, and illustrates how Berkeley faces diverse issues regarding exclusion, gentrification, displacement, which complicate the challenge of addressing exclusionary zoning and relates to issues of economic and climate equity. So you can see here, we have advanced gentrification in the purple. These are traditionally been our African-American parts of town, and we're seeing a wide turnover because housing prices have skyrocketed. And researchers at Cal have identified that racial segregation is correlating with areas that have more single-family zoning. So you can look at the Othering and Belonging Institute. They have great research there. And so making progress on exclusionary zoning required attention to all of these interrelated issues. Part of what I hear from constituents is concern over sort of these shared problems. So the emails I get are around housing affordability, homelessness, climate change, and Berkeleyans, you know, for the most part, it's a pretty progressive community. They say we're for racial and economic equity, affordability, and climate justice, but are we pursuing evidence-based policies to achieve that? And up until the past few years, there was pretty stiff opposition to pursuing these evidence-based policies to address that. So while Berkeley was hostily anti-development in 2017, so much that we ended up in the national news, and I've been talking for a while, since 2014, around zoning and housing accessibility, it first really became, more people started to embrace this conversation starting around 2018, and particularly in 2020. 2020, as we all know, provided a real opportunity for dialogue around these problematic issues of systemic racism and economic inequities, public health, and all of these conversations were happening not only locally, but nationally as well. And regardless of people's opinions on land use, Berkeley in particular coalesces around some of these shared values. So I felt like there was a really big window in 2020 to talk about the overlap of our land use policies and these shared identified problems. Now, it's my job then to connect these policies and my love for data and research and communicate them in a non-wonky way to bring as many people on board as possible. And so, much to my surprise, we were able to unanimously pass legislation to end exclusionary zoning, and were subsequently cited by the governor in his most recent signing of legislation to undo single-family zoning in California, and were mentioned by the White House as a model to address these issues around affirmatively furthering fair housing. So if I could go to the next slide, we can sort of talk about what is possible. So this is an example of a project near our downtown, and it shows a multifamily infill modular project that has a green roof and grows food for local restaurants. And this is just an example of how we can help address sort of these housing scarcity, housing affordability issues in our communities, and help adapt to climate change and chip away at the legacies of injustice and exclusion. So I'm happy to take any questions, and I really appreciate you all being here and giving me an opportunity to talk about this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vice Mayor Drosty. I was just trying to add some links to the chat for folks to learn more about the landmark legislation in California. We'll be sure to add that. So thank you to all of our panelists. Great, we have some time for questions and answers, and we have some from the chat. I also just want to let you all know that if you have questions for each other, please go ahead, interrupt me and ask them. I would love to have some back and forth. You all have, I'm sure, responses and are curious about others' presentations. One question we received is something that I was also thinking about while hearing these presentations. Here in the Boston area, as well as, I'm sure, as you mentioned, California and in Virginia, we often hear this false dichotomy of environmental interests and pro-housing interests, and specifically tree cover versus infill, or tree cover versus transit-oriented development. And so I wonder what your thoughts are on how do you see environmental interests aligning with housing interests? And one person from the audience, specifically said, how do we address housing people as they return to more urban neighborhoods, or neighborhoods that a lot of people have been living in, but more people are joining, balancing that with needing to protect the 5-degree or 10-degree difference that we've noticed. So I think I'll start with Vice Mayor Drosty, but would love to hear others' thoughts. So how does the housing interest actually align with environmental interests?
Sure. I mean, actually, there's a great overlap, and that's something that I think people have really begun to see in the last few years. I think the environmental movement has changed quite a bit, and I think it's been really helpful, as I mentioned before, when we have climate researchers studying this issue, saying, if you look at our cool climate calculators and you're measuring the impact, your carbon footprint, and by creating infill housing, this is the number one thing that we can do, at least in Berkeley, to reduce the impact on our Earth. That's an evidence-based policy we want to pursue. And if we think too about this connection between the scarcity of homes for individuals in places where they work, lead to massive commutes. So if we look at the transportation emissions, if you look, I would venture to say any city, and you look at those pie charts about where these emissions are coming from, they're coming from cars. And if people are not able to live in the communities in which they work, you're going to continue to see that happen. So it really is essential when you're working in a metropolitan area that we're able to provide more opportunities for people to have homes.
Great, thanks. Do you want to, yeah, please, Mr. Lilly.
Thank you. I just want, well, 2 points I just want to make very quickly. First, whenever somebody presents something as a choice of, well, you can either have this or you can have trees, those are almost always false choices. That's not what the choice is. Part of what you need to do is get people to stop looking at trees as something nice to have. Trees are part of our infrastructure. Public trees are public infrastructure. No, you wouldn't say we don't have room for a fire hydrant. You wouldn't say we don't have room for a street lamp. Well, then you don't say we don't have room for trees. It's a matter of creating space, and you make that part of your design criteria. You must create space for public trees. We must create some green space. There are creative solutions, and there is a tree literally for every type of space. It's a question of designing that, baking that into your design. And once you say trees are, and we've had great success, and the city of Lawrence has been a terrific project partner with us. We've changed that mindset. Every road improvement project now in Lawrence has space for trees, either planting strip or tree pits, and we come right in as soon as that project's done, and we put the trees in where they never have been before. You've got to be a little creative. You can't say can't, or you can have this or that. It's never the case.
Thanks. Dr. Hoffman, did you want to add anything? I saw you motioning, or interested in this discussion of housing interests and environmental interests in the State House as well.
There's a really interesting some particular cities have started to figure this out. Some in Europe and some here in the United States. Portland's Better Housing by Design incorporates what is known as, well, it's Seattle as well, and then some places overseas have developed what is known as a green factor score. And so it's a super wonky zoning thing, right? But it's basically that, as you increase the greenery and public green spaces that you can have. Oh, Somerville, I see it, Sasha put in the chat, Somerville, Massachusetts has one as well. So you get rewarded for putting in green spaces, or there are some that mandate it as part of certain densities. So it really becomes like, what kind of policy it looked like maybe the Berkeley example that Vice Mayor Drosty showed had some sort of requirement for rooftop greenery, and so those sorts of things drastically improve the greenness of the feeling of being in a city. And I think countries like Singapore would be one of the perfect examples of somewhere that has invited nature into an extremely dense city. So I agree with Mr. Lilly that this kind of these one or the other kind of dichotomy is really just made not out of good faith and not out of a scientific understanding of how urban spaces can evolve.
And I would just add that, look, climate justice is housing justice, right? I mean, these things are clearly overlaid, and we have to work on both of them simultaneously. And then from a macro level, when you zoom out, one of the greatest costs for residents across the country is housing, right? And if we want consumers to make smarter decisions about their purchases, one of the best ways to do that is by alleviating one of the greatest costs that they have, which is housing.
I welcome the fifth panelist of that sweet little dog to join.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm like wrestling with him under here right now, so I apologize.
I'm glad that my cat has been well behaved. Thank you so much. Another question we have from the chat is specifically about Lawrence and tree planting strategies. So does liability or maintenance for trees planted on private property come into the public engagement effort in Lawrence, and wonder about management of the tree planting?
Sure, that's a great question. That's actually a question that comes up sometimes when you're talking to residents. We try to put the majority of trees in private yards because it's going to be better for the tree. They'll be better cared for. They'll be wanted. Their life is just so much better than being stuck in the sidewalk or next to a roadway. Trees have a long lifespan, and if you have a tree in your yard, you have to have a responsibility for maintaining it. That just comes with owning a home, and that's pretty much how we approach it. Just like anything else, you have to replace your roof after 30 years. Once your tree is mature, every few years you got to take a look at it and give it a haircut. Or if it looks sick, you call an arborist. And when the tree is finally, if it's old enough, if it's at a point where it's in steep decline and maybe isn't safe, you have to make the decision. It's not like in the forest where you can just let it do whatever it wants. You have to remove that tree for your own safety. So it just sort of comes with the cost of owning and maintaining a home. Or if you own rental property, that's part of the maintenance. But the benefits that tree will give you for the 75, 100, 150 years that it's there vastly outweigh those maintenance costs. The savings in energy, the more healthy environment, the increase in property values that it will provide, it's a very small price to pay for having that. Occasionally pruning it and raking some leaves. And you'd be surprised how big an obstacle that can be. But yeah, it's part of the conversation, definitely.
Great, thank you. So we only have a few minutes left, and this is a big question, but an important one, so I'm going to ask it. And that is, as we are reflecting today on the unintended consequences of policies that planners like us have established, I'm interested in both in greening strategies and underinvested neighborhoods, as well as infill strategies and upzoning, what the risk of gentrification is and what your thoughts are on mitigating unintended displacement pressures. And I will start with anyone who wants to go first.
Sure,
Okay, Vice Mayor. Yeah.
I'd be happy to go. Well, clearly this is something that's really important to Berkeley residents. And in fact, the head of the Urban Displacement Project supported our legislation, because what we need to remember is that single family zoning prohibits the creation of affordable housing. So I think that's often lost on people, is that we have virtually in many communities, 3/4 of the land is not able to create affordable housing. And in fact, there was a study in Portland that showed through this type of zoning reform, we're reducing the risk of displacement, because right now what we're seeing is that the housing costs are skyrocketing. People are coming in and displacing our community. And so that's why we've received a wide variety of support from affordable housing providers, anti-displacement scholars, the National Low Income Housing Coalition. But nonetheless, I mean, we want to make sure that we're incorporating and still maintaining tenant protections for to ensure that the demolition of people's homes would not be occurring. And that's actually a state law through a state bill SB 330 here in California. But we absolutely need to approach any type of zoning reform with care. But again, as I had mentioned, right now we're seeing unaffordability throughout the bulk of our cities. And in order to address this and to curb displacement, we need to have zoning reform in order to affirmatively further fair housing.
Yeah, if I could just add very quickly, any efforts that we engage in to green a community have to be situated within a much larger, more comprehensive revitalization agenda. And stability is great and it's important. You creating meaningful economic opportunity that empowers people is important. Having climate safe neighborhoods is an important part of that agenda. Having neighborhoods that don't flood regularly or that aren't 20 degrees hotter than their more affluent neighborhoods is part of any agenda to make people's lives better. And I always say when people question whether or not we should be planting more trees or spending our resources in that neighborhood, the people in the neighborhood that I live in, which is in the heart of our northern planting zone, the people in that neighborhood deserve street trees and green space and unpaved backyards. They deserve these things as much as anyone else. So gentrification is always something we will wrestle with in this arena, but we shouldn't not make our communities better and more livable for fear of having some unintended consequences. We can do something about that, but we have to start with creating a green and resilient community.
I would just add that home ownership has to be a part of the equation here, right? As we start to make really beautiful and great communities that everyone deserves to live in. I think it's important for folks who traditionally haven't had access to home ownership opportunities to benefit from that and to build some equity to pass down and address intergenerational wealth gaps as well.
Thank you. With that, I want to thank each of our panelists so much for your time and thoughtfulness. Dr. Hoffman, did you want to have a final word on that question? Or yeah, okay. Thank you all so much, and thank you everyone who attended. We will be sending the recording of this panel to everyone who registered, and we'll be posting it on our website, which is in the chat. Thank you so much, Cami, Sasha, and Van, and Mark, my colleagues, who did a lot of work in helping organize and run this event. Thanks very much, and keep your eye out for the next Accelerating Climate Resiliency panel in a couple months.
Thank you, everybody. Great job.